Good afternoon. Before we formally start, I want to welcome you to today's webinar, but also want to provide some important reminders. So we do have live captioning available for today's webinar. At the bottom of your screen, you should be able to find a live captioning link at the bottom, and make sure that you enable that, and you'll be able to see the live captioning. The video recording will also include live captioning as well. The chat has been disabled. And while you're free to use the Q&A feature, please know that we may not have time to answer questions, as Sherry has a lot of questions as well for Helen. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kate Morris, to formally start our session today. Kate?
Thank you, Ray. Good afternoon. I am acting co-provost, Kate Morris, and I'm here to welcome you to part 3 of our speaker series, SCU Listens and Learns, Race, Reflection, and Renewal. This series is co-sponsored by many offices across campus: the Office of the President, the Office of the Provost, the College of Arts and Sciences, the Office for Student Life, the Office of Undergraduate Admission, the Office for Diversity and Inclusion, and the Center for Arts and Humanities. Through their joint efforts, we have had the opportunity to hear in this series from lifelong community acts such as Dolores Huerta and Luis Valdez, Anthony Romero from the ACLU, and Eva Patterson of the Equal Justice Society. And now we're honored to host journalist, writer, and activist Helen Zia, and our own SCU counseling psychology professor Sherry Wang, as they talk about combating anti-Asian hate, past, present, and future of Asian American activism. Before we get started, I'd like to pause to offer Santa Clara's land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that Santa Clara University sits on the land of the Ohlone and Muwekma Ohlone people, who trace their ancestry through the missions Dolores, Santa Clara, and San Jose. We remember their connection to this region and give thanks for the opportunity to live, work, learn, and pray on their traditional homeland. Let us take a moment of silence to pay respect to their elders and to all Ohlone people of the past and present. Thank you. Now it is my pleasure to introduce you to Helen Zia, the author of Asian American Dreams, The Emergence of an American People, Last Boat Out of Shanghai, the epic story of the Chinese who fled Mao's revolution, and countless award-winning publications on topics ranging from countering hate violence and homophobia to immigration policy and international civil rights. Helen was the executive editor of Ms. Magazine, is a frequent guest on NPR, CNN, and is often featured in the New York Times and Washington Post. She was named one of the most influential Asian Americans of the decade by A Magazine. And while I could go on at length about Helen's incredible accomplishments, I want to tell you a more personal story about how I first met Helen, or when I first met Helen. There were several of us at a dinner party over at her house, and I found myself perusing her bookshelves in the living room. There was an object there that I couldn't quite make sense of. It was a long cylinder, about 2.5 feet long, metal, and inscribed with beautiful scrolling patterns. Now, I'm a scholar of indigenous art, but I couldn't place this. Was it a musical instrument? A pipe? A ceremonial weapon? Well, it turns out it's an Olympic torch, the one that Helen Zia was selected to carry as part of a worldwide torch relay for the 2008 Beijing Olympics. I admit I'd never met an Olympic torch bearer before, but I find it fitting that Helen was chosen. Not only did she carry that torch, but she used the platform to raise her voice, to speak out against China's poor human rights record. Today, Helen is still carrying the torch for Vincent Chin and for Grandma Shia and for all the victims of this rising tide of violence against Asian Americans that we are facing. It is truly an honor to have her here with us today. So I'll turn the mic over now to SCU Professor Sherry Wang, a licensed psychologist, researcher, and anti-racist educator. Since the start of the COVID pandemic, Professor Wang has been featured, cited, and interviewed in the media on the topic of anti-Asian racism, cross-racial coalition building, and xenophobia. Thank you, Sherry, for leading our discussion today.
Thank you, Kate. Helen, we're so excited to have you. You are my role model. I don't know what I did to be able to have this opportunity, but we have lots of questions to begin to ask you. So I'm just going to jump in, if that's okay, and really kind of get into this big picture question that well, I think the issue really is that many people mistakenly think of anti-Asian violence right now as the worst that it's ever been, or it's never been this bad before, but it has been this bad, even worse. And it's important to know that so we can learn from it, right? From the immigration acts that have specifically targeted Asian Americans to the laws that have treated Asian Americans as foreigners and spies and enemies of the state, such as with the incarceration of Japanese Americans in World War II. Anti-Asian sentiments are actually the norm rather than the exception, right? And so especially with then your role in pushing forward the civil rights and justice of the death of Vincent Chin, what would you say are the parallels that you see now between the murder of Vincent Chin in 1982 and the ways in which hate incidents and hate crimes are being treated these days?
Well, thank you for that question. It really does frame this very important moment that we're at. And so Dr. Wang, or Sherry, if I may, let me also just thank Santa Clara University, Dr. Russell, Dr. Morris, Kate, that was quite an over-the-top introduction. And I'm very glad to be here. And for you students, we're going to dive in and talk about other times, but I do want to say this is your time. This is your time to make a big difference in the direction of this country and this world. So to your point, Sherry, when this particular wave of anti-Asian hate began, not a year ago, not, it really, we can pinpoint December 2019 as the beginning of the coronavirus and how all of the anti-China rhetoric and hate that was spewed from, even from the white supremacy house at that time, it's not new. A lot of people were saying, wow, I never knew this, or wow, you Asian Americans, you experienced discrimination. I never knew that. Or even now you know what racism is like. And the only answer to that is to say, we've known what racism is like, but the invisibility of Asian Americans has been so deep that even among Asian Americans, many in our own communities don't even know our own history, which is unfortunate because then they would know that there is nothing new about this at all. And as you pointed out, I mean, Asian Americans have gone through ethnic cleansing where, people of Asian descents, first starting with the Chinese and then spreading to all Asian Americans, were banned from becoming citizens, barred by immigration, targeted, of course, during World War II, incarcerated, for the duration of the war in American concentration camps. And so there's a lot that's happening now that's happened before. And, with the, in the 1800s where Chinese women first, and then all Chinese, and then later all Asians were banned and ethnically cleansed, basically eliminated from the Western United States, that was a terrible time. I mean, we saw Chinatowns being burned, people being massacred. One of the biggest lynching massacres, mass lynchings in US history was in Los Angeles, directed against Chinese Americans. And so we're not at that point. However, we have already had 2 mass killings, in Atlanta as well as Indianapolis, Asian American women, and then Sikh Americans. And we've had mass killings of Asian Americans before, even in current time. And so it's not ancient history. I lived through a period that was very much like today, where you referenced the Vincent Chin case. And that was in Detroit. It's, Detroit, Michigan, as the epicenter of a place that generated a whole Asian American civil rights movement, a national movement, with a city like Detroit as its improbable center. And what happened then was that the entire auto industry and the manufacturing sector of America collapsed. because of an oil crisis, a significant global oil crisis, and people weren't buying American cars. The whole industry collapsed. And, you know, Santa Clara University is in the Silicon Valley, and that was the beginning of the US economy completely restructuring, shifting away from manufacturing, industrial America to the information and service industry that we have today. That was what happened then. But in the course of these, you know, tectonic, really, it was an earthquake in the economy. All those people in industrial America lost their jobs. There was, you know, a question whether they would ever have these well-paid union jobs ever again, and many didn't. And so people were suffering. I was in Detroit then. I had more or less majored in political activisms, community activism when I was a student, and not really, not officially, but that's what I focused on. And so I ended up in Detroit. I got a job in a auto factory because somebody said to me, if you want to know about real social change in America, you should go to the heartland of America. And I did. And so I was there when the auto industry collapsed. I knew how much hatred there was, how much anguish and misery there was. I was unemployed, you know, long-term unemployed like everybody else, you know, in the industrial heartland of America. And in that time, you know, when there is a crisis, politicians and, you know, people of authority look for other people to blame. And throughout history, as you pointed out, that has been, you know, people of Asian ancestry. This is a repeated pattern. And so in the 1980s, after the auto industry collapsed because of an oil crisis, Japan was blamed. Why? Because Japan made fuel efficient cars. People were buying them instead of the American dinosaurs that got 7 or 8 miles a gallon. The thing is, Germany also made and still makes fuel efficient cars, but racism and blaming and scapegoating only works when, you know, the target looks different. So Japan was blamed. And so out of that was generated incredible anti-Japanese hatred that as an Asian American, we know that we all get lumped together. So it really didn't matter whether you were of Japanese descent or Chinese or whatever. Every Asian American was like, we had a target on our backs during that time. You know, the Congress, people were saying, send the atom bomb back to Japan, blow the whole country up. Why? Because we're in an economic war. Well, you could just take the anti-Japanese words and put it now with anti-China words, right? And the level of hate that existed then exists today. And so in that time, a young man named Vincent Chin, who was a Chinese American young man about to be married, out on the town for his bachelor party, sat across, you know, a bar from 2 white auto workers who said, it's because of you mother Fs that we're out of work. And then they stalked him through the streets of Detroit, found a guy and said, let's get the Chinese, and caught up with him, beat his brains out into the street, and he was killed in that hate crime. And out of that moment came a movement where Asian Americans who had never joined together in the past before realized that, hey, Vincent Chin was killed, but that could have been any one of us. And we really have to stand up, talk about racism against Asian Americans, talk about how that experience, we should not have to repeat this. And, you know, came together in a civil rights movement, joined with African-American civil rights organizations, joined with Latinx, LGBTQ folks, people of every religion and background, Arab Americans who are quite numerous in the Detroit area. And so out of a terrible tragedy came a movement to stand up, and it was multiracial, multi-class, multicultural. And so here we are today, you know, at a time very, very similar, and people are wondering, what can we do? Well, if we learn from history, we know we could have predicted, you know, that the way this is unfolding. And in fact, many of us did. You know, I wrote an op-ed piece a year ago saying this is going to get worse. And we know that because of history. And even today, I am sad to say, it's not going away anytime soon. And what it will take, like the lessons of history, is people standing up together, standing up to say, this is wrong, this shouldn't be happening to any people. The hate that's going around directed at Asian Americans, we know there's violence against other communities too. The Black Lives Matter movement, what's, you know, the continuing deaths of Black Americans at the hands of police. You know, that has to stop. We draw a link between the systemic racism and white supremacy. And so what it's going to take, and we know this from history, is people standing up together to say an injury to one is an injury to all. And so those are lessons from not so long ago.
Not so long ago that are relevant now and relevant for the future, right? Because this will, with history repeating itself, anytime there is any type of an economic, political, or military threat abroad, right, with any part of Asia, it's Chinese this time, right? China this time, it's going to come back to affect all Asian Americans then at a later time.
Right, absolutely.
You know, a lot of the onus, though, I feel like on the movement, and perhaps it's because there's the hashtag, right? Stop Asian hate, stopping AAPI hate. A lot of the onus, though, seems to be placed on Asian Americans. You know, the need to report, to speak up, to become politically involved. To me, though, there's an element that almost seems a bit victim blaming. You know, putting all of that responsibility on a community that is currently being racially targeted, when really it is, like you were saying, it is a collective responsibility on all of our society to work together, to change and to speak up. And so as an activist who has been on the ground at the grassroots level, what are some concrete things that you think we need to do as a larger society to address this issue that's not just about the hate? The hate is the extreme part, right? But it is really this larger issue of anti-Asian sentiments or racism that is the heart of what then culminates into hate incidents or hate crimes.
Right. Well, yes, it does seem like the onus is on Asian Americans, but I have to say that that is partly because of the very, you know, stereotypes or one-dimensional ways that Asian Americans have been viewed, which is that we don't complain, we are the hardworking worker bees, the coolies of today. I actually say, you know, today there are the high-tech coolies that are not unlike the way that the railroad workers were treated, you know, used as expendable labor, work hard, do all of the stuff that nobody else will do, and even get killed, you know, digging their ways through the Rocky Mountains in order to build the railroads. And they were coolies, meaning they were less than human. They were not full human beings. And so when the railroads were done, those coolies could get eliminated, which is what happened. They were gotten rid of in those massacres and the ethnic cleansing. And so today what we have are high-tech coolies, you know, the expectation that, well, these are the Asian Americans, they'll do the work, they'll do all this stuff, and they will never complain. And so even if they are the targets of hate, they will just be the you know, the good little, you know, I have to say, worker bees or worker ants, which are subhuman, right? They're not full human beings. And, you know, stuff will happen. You step on an ant, well, too bad. And I hate to put it that way, but, you know, this model minority racist myth means that for Asian Americans to get any attention at all, we not only have to raise our voices, we have to raise them together and loud, because otherwise, you know, there's this almost, you know, blocking out of anything that Asian Americans experience. So for example, the idea that Asian Americans never experience racism, that is part of this thread that goes along with the, you know, the model minority racist myth. And I call it that because, you know, as you pointed out, Asian Americans never defined ourselves that way. Any of you who are watching and want to do a quick search on this, you know, the model minority came from a white sociologist, an academic who created that to pit Asian Americans as the good minority against Black Americans as the bad minority. at a time of the height of the civil rights movement. I mean, what could be more obvious to take, you know, this group of people, Asian Americans, who are treated as the enemy, aliens, to be imprisoned and, you know, as potential invaders of America, and suddenly they become the model minority. Well, there was a purpose to that. And unfortunately, it has infected all of us, including Asian Americans. There are many Asian Americans who I've talked to who have said, well, what's wrong with being the good minority? Is that bad to be seen as a model? Well, yes, it is, because everything else that goes along with it. First of all, that you're being seen as good so that somebody else can be treated as bad. And then as well as the expectation that you will accept anything that is meted out to you with a smile and never complain. And so with the anti-Asian hate that, you know, is a pattern, and we're experiencing this, you know, very intensively now. You know, in order to do something about it, we have to first of all cleanse our own minds. You know, unlearn the things that say, well, you should be quiet, don't make waves. You Asian people, you never speak up. It's cultural, which is not true. Look at Asia; it's simply not true. And to say, you know what? If we don't stand up for our full humanity, why should we expect anybody else to? And so, yes, there's an element of, well, it's, you know, the onus is on Asian Americans, but we have to speak up. If we don't do it, why should we expect anybody else to do it for us? And I think we have to speak louder too, you know, because there is a higher bar for Asian Americans to even establish that a killer in Atlanta who goes on an hour-plus ride to seek out Asian businesses and to kill Asian women, to immediately the sheriff says, oh, that has nothing to do with race. I mean, how much more obvious can you get? But the killers of Vincent Chin, who said, it's because of you mother Fs that we're out of work, and then let's get the Chinese. If you actually parse that language, there's not a racial slur in there. And so the juries in those cases said, well, you know, it's not obvious that, you know, we don't think that there was race involved because they didn't use a racial slur. Well, you know, what are the words that need to be said to establish that an attack, you know, one of the 4,000 plus attacks that have been reported to one website so far, that they are racially motivated, or somebody chose to attack an Asian American person because of who they are and how they look? What needs to be said? And in fact, anybody who experiences racism or sexism or homophobia, you know, nothing needs to be said. You can tell when somebody is coming at you that, you know, or just glaring at you, that the vibe is clearly, you know, a negative thing that contains hate. So no words really need to be said. But for Asian Americans, unfortunately, part of the pattern is also that, you know, somehow we have to prove, and, you know, with a certified thing saying they used a racial slur. So that's all part of Asian Americans having to speak up and establish who we are ourselves. And unfortunately, that is an added burden that maybe other groups might not experience. You know, if this guy in Atlanta had hunted out 3 different synagogues in 3 different areas of Atlanta and let loose, would people say, well, I wonder if that's really anti-Semitism, you know? But for Asian Americans, they do. They wonder that. There's a whole debate about it. And that's, to me, just, you know, part of the invisibility, part of the wrongful way that Asian Americans have been depicted in American society. And we have to stand up against it. And we have to have our allies, our fellow community people of conscience from all communities to you know, open up their minds, decolonize, root out this poison, and start looking at the real stories and the real experiences of real Asian Americans.
I think what you're saying too, Helen, is that the ways in which the model minority myth has dehumanized us, that we actually have to prove our humanness, right? There's multiple pieces of proving that we are humans too, and that we have feelings, and when we bleed blood too,
Right,
as
right.
well as this notion of and we're people of color, because the model minority myth has really made it so that we are actually a symbol to say we live in a colorblind world, right? A way to say, listen, look at Asian Americans. They've overcome internment. They've overcome Chinese Exclusion Act. They've overcome lynchings. And listen, if they can do it, Black people, problem communities, why don't you, right? And so in this way that it's really made us, and I would say that that way of framing us has been exploitative. It has not been consensual, right?
Right. And as you know, through the counseling work you do, that for Asian Americans, it's also very corrosive internally. People who say, well, what's wrong with being a model? Well, what's wrong is we see the mental health issues, the high suicide rates, the Asian Americans who feel like, well, how could I have a problem? How could I be depressed when everybody says I should be perfect? I'm the model. And the pressures that parents put on their kids all goes inside. Why am I being attacked? I don't understand that. And it leads to all kinds of other issues within our communities, not to mention being completely ignored by governmental authorities or whatever. Oh, what, you have poverty in Asian American communities? You don't need food stamps. You don't need health care in Asian communities because you don't have medical problems. You don't have people who are unemployed. You don't have people who are mentally ill, and that's simply not true. Asian Americans are human beings. We have all of those things, but that's part of, as you said, it's part of the dehumanization.
It's a dehumanization of us, and it is also then, I think, a challenge because of so much diversity amongst us, right? I mean, thinking about the fact that any income inequality is the greatest amongst, right, within the pan-ethnic Asian group, that it really is about solidarity within the Asian American community too, right? Because we also have a lot of nationalism, right? Of like, this is a Chinese problem, this is a Japanese problem, right? This is the Filipino problem. And so for us, when I think about standing up as Asian Americans, it isn't just like standing up for me, because I think it is very hard to ask for people to stand up for themselves, but standing up for other Asian Americans as well, because we are not a monolith. And I think that's something we don't talk about as much.
Right. Well, on the one hand, Asian, the identification or the moniker of Asian American, it's an umbrella, right? But Asia is the biggest continent and has the most diversity of cultures, languages, religions, people, every way that people express themselves as human beings. Asian countries, the Asian continent has that incredible diversity, yet here we are all under one umbrella. And as you said, I mean, the income disparity just within the Asian, umbrella is vast. And so on the one hand, coming together to stand up, we have, more power by being united. On the other hand, the negative side of that is that, everybody gets blended together. And so we miss, we in the Asian community miss the fact that there are more vulnerable Asian communities that can be identified. That if we, for example, counted people and disaggregated, to say, okay, what's going on in the Pacific Islander community? What is the Pacific Islander community? What about, the Filipino community, the Hmong community, and how does that compare to newer immigrants and newer generations of Asians and people who come here as refugees? It's just really a vast, difference that actually can be, readily found if we bother to look, if we bother to count. And when I say count, I do mean census, but I also mean, data that, for example, Santa Clara counts, or data that's collected by these websites and stuff, that can be done without actually looking closer. How do we, we can find things, a fact like, of all the nurses in America who have died because of COVID, 1 out of every 3 is Asian American. And actually 1 out of every 3 is Filipino.
Mhm.
And Filipinos make up about 4% of all nurses in America, yet more than 30% of the nurses who have died are Filipino. You know, I don't understand why that one incredibly tragic detail isn't discussed all over
Right.
the place to say, well, what is that? Why? And to learn something more about the Filipino American community. Why are there so many nurses? Why are they so exposed and vulnerable in this way? And we could look at the Filipino American community that way, but we could also look at the Hmong American community. You know, we could look at any one of many different parts of the Asian American community and realize that it's simply not true, this model minority racist myth that's applied to everybody. You know, yes, there are some Asian Americans who do quite well, but there are many others, you know, who are who are vulnerable, who are out there exposed in every way that the coronavirus has exposed, you know, our most essential and vulnerable communities. And we don't count, we are not counted. And this is the part that Asian Americans have to stand up and insist upon with our allies, with other communities.
Yeah, we're oftentimes not even included when we look at the death rates or the disproportionate toll in looking at racial ethnic differences with COVID. Asians are not even, Asian Americans as a whole are not even included, much less the particular ethnic groups that have been most affected.
That's right. That's right. I mean, when I look at, you know, studies that come out, and I would say at least 95% of them don't even look at Asian Americans. There are a few that do. In fact, one that Asian Health Services in Oakland commissioned, which is a look at how Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are experiencing COVID from a medical point of view, as well as from the social, you know, that what's going on with the.
Yeah. Can I also add one more thing, Helen? And this is just because I learned this when I attended a lecture earlier this week from a sociologist, that when they have looked at the data on income, right, and really looked at then, you know, Asian American data tends to look higher, right, when it comes to income inequality, that Asian Americans are doing even better than white Americans. That data actually, not only is it a failure to disaggregate by Asian ethnic subgroups, but if you look at then where Asian Americans live in this country, it's in states and cities that have a higher cost of living. So places like Hawaii, and in places like San Francisco, in Los Angeles, New York City, in Chicago. And so we're looking at that and comparing it to other ethnic racial groups in places that are like Alabama or Mississippi.
Right.
And so of course, then it looks like Asian Americans are doing so much better because it does not take into consideration cost of living. And then when you do look at that and we break it down by household contribution and you know, number of people in a household, you see that Asian Americans actually are not doing so well, even as a whole. And so I learned that this week and thought that is so important for us to talk about too, just as a larger group.
That is such an important point, and it just completely gets lost in every you know, report about income breakdowns by race and ethnicity and stuff. I mean, the Asian American population is an urban population. You know, 1 out of every 3 Asian Americans lives in California, which is a high cost of living state.
Yes.
And so none of that is broken down, as you point out, Sherry. And so, you know, but just by averaging, you know, all of the incomes and saying, well, you know, it's really apples to oranges, and it just goes on to feed this model minority racist myth, like, oh, all you Asians. And the other part of it is it says, well, Asians then, because we don't know anything about you, well, really, you're just like white people, except, or maybe not quite like white people, but you are honorary whites. And so we can just totally ignore you. And not only that, you are white adjacent or white identified or all this stuff, which only adds to sort of the silencing and marginalization of Asian Americans. And you know, I do want to say it's not just about what's been done to Asian Americans, in that way. You talked about victim blaming, but there's also so many things Asian Americans have done to resist all of this, this history of racism that has really contributed to every American. Every American has benefited. For example, the right to be an American citizen because you are born in this country was every person descended from immigrant stock in America should thank an Asian American, Wang Kim-ark, a Chinese American who resisted that period of ethnic cleansing and the Chinese Exclusion Act, and took, with the support of the other Chinese community, took his case all the way to the US Supreme Court. And because of Wang Kim-ark, in 1898, the Supreme Court said that anybody born in America is an American citizen. And so, just imagine, first that there is resistance, that people have fought for their rights. Asian Americans have fought, have done incredible things, have joined with other groups. While Wang Kim-ark was doing that, Frederick Douglass, who, an amazing Black American leader of that time in the 1890s, said, Black Americans must oppose the Chinese Exclusion Act. He stood up in support of the Chinese. And so we have an example of cross-racial, support, around something that actually ended up benefiting all Americans to be born here and be a citizen. And that is completely missing in our history too. So that invisibility also, means that people don't know the contributions that everybody has benefited from, and that also ends up silencing us. So these are things we have to claim back. We have to unlearn the poison and then, learn our real history of things that we can all be very proud of, and see that, we're not the only ones who are speaking up either. There has been a long history of Asians in America speaking up and ending up, making positive change for everybody.
Yeah, claiming that history seems really, really empowering in that way too. And in a way to really push back against the model minority stereotype, right? Because one of the ways the model minority stereotype kind of makes invisible our suffering is it also makes invisible our achievements. Because we're supposed to be high achieving, it really doesn't recognize when we accomplish. And it has not recognized that Asian Americans actually are activistic, right? Have been engaged politically, because in the context of the 1960s, we were used to contrast the Black community, to say, hey, why are Black people, why are you so politically active? You should be like Asian Americans, as a contrast. So it looks then like, by that comparison, we are not politically active when we actually have been. So all of these ways in terms of who is telling our story and through what lens, it is a way for us to claim back to say, no, we are telling our story from our perspective.
I think that's really important. And certainly today, with the technology and the ability to use the internet, and anybody who has a smartphone can use this technology to tell our stories. Because with the silencing and the invisibility, Asian Americans have been subject to what others have created for us, whether that's Hollywood, the people who have produced textbooks or movies in the past, and an academic who wrote, "This is the model minority," and then it got integrated, into American society, that, oh yes, this is a model minority. And so all of those things were not created by us. It wasn't saying like, this is my community. This is how different Asian groups that might have been in conflict with each other finally came together. How were they able to do that and join with Black and Latinx and, other communities? That's missing, but that's the story that we have to tell. And now we have the means, they're really the means to do that. We're not dependent on, some $100 million thing in Hollywood to tell our story. It's more that we can do that. And so we have to find every way we can to amplify the reality of our lives, you know, and to use the, you know, and I have to say the students at Santa Clara, I mean, it's your generation that really will master this stuff. I can barely write a post, you know, on you know, on the social media, but you are, you know, have that capability. And so by not only creating the real story of the world around you, you know, and the people you know, and what your learning is about what the significance of you know, of any of these things, like that it's, you know, 1 out of every 3, you know, nurses in America who dies from COVID is Filipino. I mean, take that, do that, amplify it, tell people what that means, tell the story behind that. And that's what it's going to take. We have to define ourselves and not let other people define us.
Yeah. Thank you, Helen. I think this segues into this next question that I have too, which is, you know, not only for us to learn our collective history, but also understanding the intersectionalities too, right, of how nuanced it is for different groups, right, from ethnic subgroups to also gender. And that's something I wanted to bring up, that with the Stop AAPI hate report that came out documenting kind of the last year, in this past year, the number of hate incidents, you know, the data show that Asian American are about 2.3 times more likely to experience hate crimes than men. And we see how Asian American women have really suffered the most throughout this pandemic. What can we do, you know, to address the intersectional oppression of gendered racism and as well as racist sexism targeting AAPI women? Because even with the shooting in Georgia, one of the rifts that happened within our community was that there were Asian men who refused to acknowledge the sexism part of that incident, really only wanting to name the racism and not willing to see that it was racism and sexism intersecting together.
Yeah, that is part of the work we have to do too. And unfortunately, you know, to see that even within our own communities, you know, why pit, you know, genders against each other? Why not, you know, look and say, this is part of the racism toward Asian Americans. It's the gendered way that racism is expressed. You know, it is 2 to 1. Asian American women have been targeted, and that includes Asian American girls, you know, who are, you know, parents are so worried about sending their kids to school, and it's adults who are bullying. It's not, you know, it's not the usual, you know, playground bullying. It's adults who are coming to bully Asian American kids. And even within that, the statistic is it's 2 to 1 girls, Asian American girls, who are being harassed, you know, with this racist stuff. And, you know, I don't understand why people can't see, including the sheriff, you know, who was on the scene doing the press conference the next day saying, oh, well, it's just sex. It's Asian women who were attacked. It doesn't have anything to do with race, and not understanding what women of color know, that racism is also gendered. And the way racism is gendered toward Asian American women, it's on the one hand, oh, you know, an exotic, hypersexualized group that, you know, might be desirable. And because of the model minority thing, you know, that racist myth, they are compliant, passive, will not fight back. And so to a predator, that makes for, unfortunately, the perfect victim, right? To a predator, it's like, oh, exotic and won't fight back, you know? And unfortunately, that has led to, even before all of this, before Atlanta, you know, why do we have this, you know, incredibly high disproportionate number of attacks against Asian American women and girls? It's partly because of the gendered, racialized way that Asian women are viewed. And our whole community, not just Asian American whole community, but our whole, you know, beloved community of America really needs to stand up and say, you know, we're not going to end police violence and institutional racism toward Black people. We're not going to end anti-Asian hate toward Asian people unless we all come together to dismantle white supremacy, to dismantle systemic racism, because we connect the dots. They're all linked together. And in fact, groups that monitor hate violence, toward every group, it's all on an uptick, and homophobic attacks, Islamophobic attacks, anti-Semitic, domestic violence is through the roof, across the world. And so all of these things are part of a larger system, of supremacy that we can only dismantle if we do it together. None of our groups can do this separately. And in fact, they are all linked. And, the old slogans from when I was a young activist, majoring in community activism, it was the people united will never be defeated. In unity, there is strength. And those aren't just slogans. It really is true. We can't defeat climate change. We can't change, make big systemic change without people coming together. And, and it's very sad to see that that gender is even being used in a way within our own communities to divide us. That's ridiculous.
Yeah. As a follow-up though, thinking about the ways in which we're split, and the ways that that's been purposeful, right? If we really think of it and recognize that white supremacy actually benefits in this way, and that we split amongst ourselves, even within our group, and then across racial groups, that lots of narratives, including the media sometimes, right, seems to pit us against each other when that isn't our history, when actually the ways in which social movements and progress has been made is when we work together. So then how can, on the other side, how can Asian Americans be better allies in cross-racial coalitions and in solidarity work?
So within the Asian American community, because it is so diverse, and that also includes different times that families and individuals have immigrated to the US. And what we see is that, the infected mind, the colonized mind that I had mentioned earlier, it's not just in the United States. It's this global poisoning that I have to say is aided and abetted and, weaponized by American media, Hollywood, television, that is really dominant, has infected all parts of the globe. And so when 2 out of every 3 Asians in America is born outside of the United States, meaning that they came either as immigrants or refugees. And in many cases, they know nothing about the struggles that other communities have had. And not only that, their minds are, filled with images from Hollywood with stereotypes of other communities, as well as, the stereotypes of Asians in America. So our communities, have a wide range. Our Asian American communities have a wide range of lack of knowledge, and I would say ignorance about where we are in America. The fact that, that the arrival of Asians to America really is part of the narrative of white supremacy in America, being brought over as labor at a time when enslaved labor was partially being disrupted. And so Asians were brought over in large numbers in the mid 1800s, largely from China and India at that time to the Caribbean, and working in the same terrible conditions that enslaved people from Africa were working. But because they were indentured, there was a different, way that they saw themselves, that, well, we are not slaves. That was one of the things that people said to themselves, even though they were working in the exact same terrible, terrible conditions. And so those are things that more recent immigrants from Asia have no idea. They know very little about the civil rights movement. So, and in fact have all the negativity that's been, embedded in their minds. So for the Asian American community, how can we be better allies? Well, number one, not only do we have to decolonize our minds with what's said about Asian Americans, but also about other communities. So, you know, that is part of the major work that has to go on to address things like anti-Blackness within the Asian American community. And that's not just toward Black people either. There's the colorism, there's the wanting to be light-skinned that has infected every part of, cultures in Asia. And all of that stuff ends up adding to the toxic mix here in the United States, no matter where people are from, feeds into the racism, feeds into the being divided. And so having conversations just about how much more we have in common with each other, how much, Asian Americans have supported other struggles, but then people from other communities and races have also supported the Asian community. I mean, there are these videos that have gone viral showing, attacks on Asian Americans and some of the very terrible physical attacks. And the ones that go viral show Black people attacking Asians. Well, the guy who did the mass killing in Atlanta and the one who did the mass killing in Indianapolis to seek out Sikh people, from the Sikh religion, they were white. Why does that racialism and the white supremacy that was expressed there not get elevated about these mass killers and their race? Instead, there's that feeding the Asian anti-Blackness and the Black anti-Asianness that totally misses the point that the Reverend Jesse Jackson came out with a just incredible statement, early on, saying that this anti-Asian violence is wrong and we must all fight against it. So did Stacey Abrams. So did Mayor Lance Bottoms in Atlanta. So did Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And if you take the time to actually look at the chat that goes on, on different social media, you'll see a lot of non-Asian names from all backgrounds saying that this is wrong. We support, we donate to the GoFundMe page, to the victims. And that's not news, that's wrong not being news. That's where we can use the platforms that we all have, in social media to elevate those things. We really have to lift up other communities to show the support that Asian Americans are getting from those communities too, and not continue to drink the poison, of these bombarded images that pit Asians against other communities of color.
Yeah, it's really about learning, really history, right? I have recently been thinking about, my hesitancy with using the term Asian American history, because it then seems like there's an Asian American history and then there's a US history, when really Asian American history is US history,
it's
right?
The people's history, right?
Yeah, it's all of our history. And so when we learn the history, it can't just be about Asian Americans' roles and contributions, but it also has to be about other ethnic, racial, marginalized communities in which we've fought together, we've allied together, we've shown up together, and really making that more of an attention, as opposed to what seems to be getting more attention these days is the racialized trauma porn, right? That gets circulated a lot through social media, that is what is being sensationalized and that we hone in on.
Yeah, I've not heard that that terminology, trauma porn, but I think it's very appropriate. This whole year plus has been traumatic for everybody. And then, you have to remember that the news, including streaming, including the internet, these are businesses. They are part of the capitalist motivated system of profits. And it's been shown, just scientific, reports on what do people respond to? They respond to fear, stories that create fear, fear, greed, sex. Actually, those are the three top things that the marketing business knows. I'm a former, journalist, in magazines, and they would say, what do we put on the cover? Fear, sex, greed, and that's why if you watch the news or see what gets promoted in your news feed, it's generally the most horrible things you can imagine that creates the feeling, and adds to that sense of trauma. What worse could happen? Oh, here, it's even worse. And that fear keeps people divided. It also, for some people, triggers a desire to blame other people for the fear and the trauma they're experiencing. And I think that is a lot what motivates these attacks against Asian Americans. Just frustration, anger, outrage, and let's attack the most vulnerable people we can find who look like the enemy that is among us. So,
The scapegoat.
right, the scapegoats, absolutely. And, and we can't give into that. And, this trauma porn, yes, that also is something that, it's poison. It's, it divides us. It's harmful. And if we're so busy fighting each other, how will we dismantle, systemic racism? How will we address systemic oppression? How will we, deal with white supremacy or male supremacy? We can't. If we're busy being divided and fighting each other,
We're too distracted.
We're distracted, and it's deliberate. It's, it is a tactic completely. It's a science, actually. There's a lot of, as you know, psychological studies. Plantation owners, would deliberately choose bringing labor that would not get along, or they assumed culturally were so different from each other that they could keep them divided. Factories, when I worked in the auto industry, you could see there were different groups that were hired deliberately to make it hard to unionize or for workers to come together. It really is a science, and we are living through that right now.
And I think what you're speaking to, in terms of the capitalism part, right, really speaks to how interconnected everything is, right? Male supremacy, white supremacy. So, I mean, although you are so renowned in the Asian American community for your activism has been intersectional, right? And when you do this work, you can't help but then do all this other work because of how interconnected it is. And you have been so active with women's rights, LGBTQ rights. You actually identify, I believe, as a human rights activist broadly, right? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And because oppression never just targets single identities, the work of activism and advocacy is so constant and long-term. How do you sustain yourself in this work? What keeps you going? What can we do to make sure we can stay in this for the long haul?
Well, you said it right there, Sherry. This is a long haul. Social change doesn't happen overnight. There are times when, there's a wave, a tsunami, a time of great change. And I believe that we are in a time where great change is possible. But those times may demand more of us. Those times, might mean that we are, running on all cylinders. But here's the thing, we can't do that continually all our lives, right? So there will be times when we know that, okay, I just had twins. I have to devote my time to, like you, to raising the next generation. And you can't be out there 24/7. There will be other times, especially if you're young and have a lot of energy and can spend, go without sleep for days on end. There may be times that really will demand being out there 24/7 for a short period of time. And I have to say that Vincent Chin time was a time like that for me. I was, just a young person then, just in my very early 30s. And many of us who were most active in building that national civil rights campaign, we were of an age of a time when we didn't have a lot of family commitments, and where we could do that, but there will be other times, where you can't. There may be aging parents to care for, children, a career, finishing school. And that is okay, because social change and activism is going to take place over the long haul. It really just means that do what you can. Don't just do nothing, because nothing helps the status quo, the retrograde. Whatever you can do, and that might mean writing a post, sending it out, helping to amplify something. And you can't be out there, for the big protest and planning that. Well, that's okay, as long as you are there in spirit and you are doing what you can. And so for me, over the long haul, there have been times where I've had to say, you know what, I can't come to a weekly meeting about this. You know, I am finishing a book and I really have to focus on finishing Asian American Dreams. You know, that is also part of my activism, but I will be back. And I mean, this is a true story. I actually did step away from a very active, you know, multiracial journalism effort at that time. And I said, I have to finish this book, but I will be back. I think I'll have to step away for a few months. And I know some people thought, oh, she's just copping out. But then I came back and I was back and actually was told, wow, you came back. You really meant what you said. And I said, yes, I did. And I hope that what I wrote will also contribute to this movement, you know, this long-term movement to, you know, bend the arc of history toward justice. You know, it only bends if we make it bend. And that is a long, you know, a long-term process, but we can make it bend a lot faster if we all come together and do what we can. And so that's what nourishes me, knowing that wherever I am, at what stage in life, you know, I'm doing what I can. And you know, if I know that other people are doing that too, that inspires me. That gives me hope that we will bend this, you know, arc of history. So for the students here, I just want to say again, you know, this is your time. This is your time where there is great potential to really make the kind of change we really need. So I hope you use this time to do what you can.
Helen, thank you so much. You are such an inspiration. One of the things I'm hearing from you is you do what you can, you come back, you show up, and we do all of this in community, knowing that this is not a sprint. It's not one of those hold your breaths kind of thing, right? But we really also have to have compassion for ourselves and one another to be able to come back and to be able to do this kind of grueling work that can take generations, right? For us to be able to really see change.
Right. Yes.
Yeah, Helen.
Sherry, thank you so much. You are an inspiration to me. And, you know, having this conversation with you and being able to share it with, you know, the community of Santa Clara University is great. Let's all build the beloved community together.
In solidarity, Helen, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So this concludes then our listen and learn activity. We have another series in May 12th that we hope other folks will come and join. But with Helen, this will be the end of our session for today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.